Welcome everyone to our first event in the Human Rights in Practice series for the spring semester, the very timely topic of vaccine access and distribution. The Duke Law Human Rights in Practice series is organized by the Center for International and Comparative Law and the Duke International Human Rights Clinic. And we also have several co-sponsors for today's event: the Duke Law Health Justice Clinic, the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute, the Duke Human Rights Center at the Kenan Institute for Ethics, and three student groups: the Health Law Society, the Human Rights Law Society, and the International Law Society. So thank you to all of our groups for co-sponsoring today's event. Our speakers today, we have first Achal Prabhala, and special thanks, he's calling in from Bangalore, India, so it's quite late at night. Achal is a writer and researcher based, as I mentioned, in Bangalore, India. He is coordinator of the Access IBSA project and a fellow of the Shuttleworth Foundation. He's an activist on issues of access to medicines, whose work spans the countries of India, Brazil, and South Africa, among other places. We're also very happy to have Aruna Kashyap with us. Aruna is senior counsel in the Business and Human Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. For today's session, we'll start off by doing a moderated Q&A, where I will ask both speakers a series of questions, after which we'll turn to questions from the audience. So I encourage everyone to submit any questions that they might have throughout the course of the earlier part of the session, and we'll turn to them towards the end. Also, if you're having any technical issues, please also feel free to submit that through the Q&A, and we have somebody who'll be monitoring that. By way of brief context, globally, according to the Bloomberg Vaccine Tracker, more than 173 million doses of the vaccine have been administered in 77 countries. Close to 80% of these doses have been given in the US, China, the EU, and the UK. Many wealthier countries had pre-purchased access to supplies to cover more than their populations, in some cases 4 times over. Although the focus of today's discussion will be global in nature, also to note that in the US, we've seen racial disparities, among other disparities in vaccination rates. Communities of color are less likely to have access to the vaccine, even as Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities have been impacted by the pandemic at disproportionately high rates. For states that have released data by race, it's been shown that white residents are being vaccinated at significantly higher rates than Black residents, in some cases 2 to 3 times higher. And even closer to home, here in North Carolina at the end of January, Black people had made up 11% of those receiving the vaccine, despite making up 22% of the population and 26% of the healthcare workforce. White people in a category including both Hispanic and non-Hispanic whites which make up 68% of the population and 82% of those vaccinated. So I'm very happy to turn to our Q&A at this point, and we'll start with a question to Achal. So can you speak to the current landscape with respect to the vaccine, including the state of the vaccine in countries in the West versus other countries, including in the global South, and speaking in particular to how distribution and vaccination are progressing in wealthier countries, middle-income countries, and poorer countries?
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you for having me, firstly. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's also such a pleasure to be here with Aruna, whose reports at Human Rights Watch I read, benefited from very much, and continue to look forward to the work that they do on this. Maybe the best place to start is by dialing back a little bit and going into the middle of 2020, when there were a flurry of vaccine deals being struck. There was large amounts of public funding that was going to what were then considered to be the leading vaccine candidates in the world, which coincidentally happened to be all based in the West. I'll get to that a little later. There were about 9 or 10 candidates by everyone's conventional wisdom, and these companies received a flood of funding from rich governments like the European Union, the United States, but also from very well-funded philanthropic initiatives like CEPI, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, and should really find a new name, I think. And Gavi, the Vaccines Alliance, who together with the WHO, the World Health Organization, formed something called the COVAX Facility, which was a new initiative of these three organizations to deliver better vaccine access to the entire world. At the time when these deals were being made, a lot of activists, including I, put in urgent queries about the fact that these deals were seemingly being made without any conditions whatsoever for access or for stretching the limits of ordinary supply. I think there were two major concerns at that time. One being the price of these vaccines, whether the price would be a limiting factor for poorer countries in the world to afford at a later stage. And the second was supply. There had never been in my human life and in most of our human lives a situation where a pharmaceutical product like a vaccine would be potentially needed by as many people, by literally perhaps something close to the population of the entire planet. And naturally, no pharmaceutical company had ever produced in that quantity before. So there were very serious questions about price and supply as to whether the price would be affordable and whether the supply would be adequate. Both of those things could have been addressed through the right conditions that governments funneling billions of dollars towards these companies could have addressed. They did not. At the time, again, conventional wisdom was that Western countries had it wrapped up. An often cited figure, which still holds true, is that the government of Canada had ordered vaccine doses to multiple times the number of people in the country, which is to say that it had covered itself several times over, as had the governments of the United States and the European Union and the United Kingdom to different extents. At the same time, there was very little known about what was happening elsewhere in the world. And what was certain was that lower income countries, or what are called least developed countries, had absolutely no access to a vaccine. They weren't even close to the pipeline to receiving doses of a vaccine. The COVAX facility and Gavi repeatedly assured us at that time in 2020 that they had this. They were going to be taking care of this because that was their job. This is what they were trying to negotiate. The problem was that they had never worked in a situation where they were competing for a vaccine with rich countries. Gavi, the Vaccines Alliance, is typically used to putting out vaccines for measles, for meningitis, for tuberculosis. These are things that I think in many Western countries, people don't even take vaccines for. So when babies are born in Western countries, they don't get these vaccines because these diseases have been eradicated there. But when babies are born in India or in Sub-Saharan Africa or other parts of Asia, they do get them. So there's very little competition for the vaccines that are the bread and butter of Gavi. And as a result, Gavi found itself in very new circumstances where it was trying to buy discounted vaccines from pharmaceutical companies at a time when there was aggressive competition for them from very rich Western countries, some of whom were willing to pay more than the sticker price of these vaccines. That did not bode well. And people said that, including I and several others. But they continued down that path. So cut to now, early 2021, and we have a very interesting situation unfolding. In the richest countries on earth, some are doing fine. Smaller countries like Israel or the United Arab Emirates are doing okay. They have close to about 20% of their populations vaccinated. They're rolling out vaccines at a really rapid pace. Countries like the United States are doing relatively fine. Countries like Canada are trying to sort out their supply. The European Union is doing particularly badly. As a confederation of countries, it doesn't seem to have sorted out when it is going to get these vast quantities of vaccine doses they ordered, and has so far only vaccinated between 2 and 3% of its population. There are riots on the streets in several countries, widespread discontent at the rate of supply of vaccines, leading in fact to Europe instituting an export ban on one particular vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, under suspicion that after paying all this money to AstraZeneca, the vaccines being produced in Europe are not going to Europe, but elsewhere. So it's not actually working out all that well for rich countries. Meanwhile, there are other things happening in the world because there are other countries in the world. This is not always apparently clear if you restrict your reading to Western media, but it is true that there are other countries, and many of those countries are middle-income countries. These are in Latin America, the Arab states in North Africa and the Middle East, many Asian states like Malaysia and Indonesia, former Eastern European states, and also countries that are on the outskirts of Europe, like Hungary and Serbia. What they're doing is turning to China and Russia for vaccines. There are two leading candidates in China: Sinopharm's Beijing vaccine, that's a state-run company, and Sinovac, which is a private pharmaceutical corporation that has a vaccine called CoronaVac. And Russia has a partnership between a state-owned biotherapeutics research laboratory called the Gamaleya Center and the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the Russian Direct Investment Fund, who have put together something called the Sputnik V vaccine. So these states, Russia and China, are supplying all the middle-income countries in the world, also promising some deals and occasionally creating sporadic supply to some lower-income countries, but really not as much as they could be doing. They're primarily supplying countries who are locked out of things like the Pfizer vaccine, but are rich enough and able enough to negotiate a large supply of the Chinese and Russian vaccines. The distinguishing thing about them is they're willing to deal. So if they cannot supply from Russia or China, they set up licensing agreements where they can manufacture, let's say in the United Arab Emirates or Brazil or Indonesia or Malaysia. They're very flexible. The Russian Sputnik V is being manufactured in the hundreds of millions of quantity in India, South Korea, Kazakhstan. And so they have this remarkable ability, seemingly, to want to deal and to get that vaccine out in as many places as they can and do as many deals as they can, which is a little in contrast to the way Pfizer and Moderna have been operating, which is to restrict their operations to a few rich countries who've given them lots of money and just stay there and really not budge. Meanwhile, you have the countries who are worst affected in the pandemic in this way for a lack of access to treatments or vaccines. And those are the lower income countries. These are the poorest countries on earth. They lack either the industrial capacity to manufacture vaccines themselves or to participate in that industrial process in any way. They also lack the financial ability to be able to strike deals, even for Russian and Chinese vaccines, which are on the more affordable side than Western vaccines. And they lack a kind of clout to be able to negotiate something for themselves in this very heated, very competitive environment where so many different people with more power than them are getting vaccines first. So roughly that's where we are, which is to say, in a situation that's really not working out well for anyone.
Thank you, Achal, for painting that somewhat despairing landscape, but very helpful to have the context. Turning now to Aruna. Aruna, Human Rights Watch issued a report last November entitled "Whoever Finds a Vaccine Must Share It," analyzing the international human rights law that's relevant to vaccine production, distribution, and access issues. And among other issues in that report, you highlight the concept of vaccine nationalism. That is that governments are making deals, as Achal just talked about, and hoarding vaccines in ways that lack transparency, as opposed to taking steps towards universal, equitable, and affordable access to the vaccine. Can you discuss the human rights that are most central to a human rights-based approach to vaccine production, distribution, and access, please?
Thank you. Thank you, thank you for having me at this program. And it's really wonderful to share the platform with Achal, who's like a renowned IP expert and has been working with the Access to Medicines movement. The work that I'll be drawing upon is work that I've done with my colleagues. So a shout out to them, Margaret Worth, Akshaya, who's also from Human Rights Watch, and especially our legal team that's worked very closely, Aisling Reedy. So at the heart of what a Human Rights Watch approach is a very, two or three questions. One is, are we at a state or in a stage in vaccine distribution where governments can ration less? That's the first question. So is there enough supply? And clearly Achal's presentation tells you there isn't enough supply. We're still struggling with the supply question a year and more into this debate, right? The second is, are vaccines going to go to the highest bidder, which is it going to go to the rich governments, people with the money to buy up the vaccines, or is there a mechanism that is going to distribute this equally across in an equitable way based on, medical science? And those are the two sort of basic questions. And the approach, the human rights approach, the driver is basically that governments will have to come together. So they're not just looking at individual action for their own populations, but international cooperation as well to protect people's rights to life, health, and decent standard of life. So how do you get to a supply of vaccine and make it as widely available and affordable, free in many contexts, so that economies recover? So a single mother sitting at home working, who's not vulnerable, possibly if she's middle-aged and doesn't have any comorbidities, is not probably going to make it into the top 3 vulnerable categories, is sitting and struggling with homeschooling 3 children online, school lockdowns. When do we reach a stage where anybody who wants to access a vaccine and get a shot can get it, right? So we have to get to that point and not have to wait till 2024, which is where, some sort of projections are, which is how long people will have to wait in many countries to get a shot. Now, if you look at it, I mean, there are 2-3 things that governments absolutely have to do. As Achal said, those with the capacity and the governments that are able to fund the development of the scientific, the R&D of the vaccine itself, what are they doing to share the benefits of the scientific research and its application? That's at the heart of this issue. So there is an obligation on governments, which has been clarified by the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, that you have to, in the pandemic especially, and during a public health crisis, that you have to share the benefits of scientific research and its application. And that intellectual property also has a social purpose, that it serves a social purpose. And you can't have vaccines priced, at a level that excludes vast numbers of people out of access. So that's the issue. So if you look at it, I mean, as Achal said, first of all, if we're asking governments questions, and this is governments using public money to fund the vaccines, fund the research and development of the vaccine. So the question is, where is this money going? Where is public money going? Under what conditions have you put this out? And so not only have governments have to condition the vaccines and use regulatory mechanisms in specific ways, but also give information to the public that generates confidence. And so transparency about what they're doing with the public money is equally important. So what kind of conditions have been attached? What are the terms and conditions? If you're the rights holder and funding a particular vaccine, how are you exercising your rights to this vaccine at a subsequent stage to share the intellectual property to maximize the supply and production to the extent that is possible to do? I mean, so these are the types of information that governments should put out. Ideally, it would be, the gold standard that human rights activists, IP experts, Access to Medicine's World, all of us are joining forces to demand is publish the contracts. Publish the contracts that you have signed with the pharmaceutical industry so we know what you have done with public money. What are these deals that have been signed? We have a right to know. Governments should be transparent about how they're using the public money. The second and the more longer term so in addition to that, of course, there are pricing controls that governments can introduce, right? I mean, and how are governments introducing measures to regulate the prices of vaccines? What are they doing with these companies, right? That's the second question that we have to demand, ask, make sure governments take action. But there are other things governments can do, which again, as more than 100 governments have pushed for this at the WTO. There are a set of intellectual property rules related to trade globally under the TRIPS agreement. And a lot of governments, especially 100-odd governments, have come together saying they want a temporary waiver in the context of a public health crisis to make sure that they take all the measures possible at the national level to enable governments to take whatever measures possible to bring this vaccine to everybody that they should bring it to. And there are only a handful of governments that are blocking this proposal, right? So if you're looking at governments taking measures internationally through international cooperation, one of the things that governments should look at is my action blocking or interfering with another government's ability to bring the vaccine, to take measures, to expand the measures that they can take? And if the answer is yes, the governments should not block it. And that's the other aspect of international cooperation that we have to stress on, that governments should take certain measures and they have to internationally cooperate and take measures both internationally and locally to make sure that they're improving the vaccine supply and cutting the delay in vaccine supply. But there are other questions also, and Achal alluded to this, which is, there have been regulatory approvals granted for vaccines, and there have been a number of questions asked of various different vaccines. So governments the obligation is not just to provide a vaccine, it has to be safe and effective. Governments have to take responsibility for what kind of vaccine is being administered ultimately to people. So putting out in the public domain, what are the criteria based on which they granted approval? What is the information that has been made available to them that they considered? What is the protocol for clinical trials that they've examined? What kinds of populations did they look at while examining approval for use? I mean, having all of this information published as well from the government side to inform the public how did they arrive at regulatory approvals will generate a lot of confidence and build trust in these vaccines, because that is really critical. Because on the one hand, you have regulatory approvals and deals being signed and some vaccines going to some governments. And on the other hand, there are constant questions about, is this safe? What is the level of transparency? Should I take it? Is it safe for a pregnant woman? Is it safe for an older person? So all of these questions keep coming back, and you have to have more transparency to answer some of these questions. And I think transparency has to be at the center, is one of the pillars of what a government can do, be it on clinical trial data, what they looked at, what kind of regulatory approvals they've granted, what are in these deals, have they published the contracts? And to some extent, we're slowly seeing this, especially after a lot of the delays around vaccine access to the high income governments. There has been a lot of pressure to start publishing these contracts, and slowly a lot more contracts are coming into the public domain, but these are redacted versions. There are heavily redacted versions that don't actually allow you to answer some of these questions properly. And so I think, and that takes me to, the question of how much publication, and is this publication sufficient to get to the meat of the answers? And that's where we have to also focus. The quality of what is being published is equally important.
Thank you, Aruna. That was incredibly helpful to lay out the human rights framework, and that it's really the most fundamental human rights that are implicated, including the right to life and to health, and that this thread of transparency really runs throughout all of these issues and all stages, from the manufacturer to the dissemination and information that people have about the vaccine. Turning again now back to Achal, the problem of an extreme imbalance in access to vaccines and access to medicines more broadly is not limited to the current situation with respect to the COVID-19 vaccine, but something that we've seen and continue to see with the lack of access, especially of particular populations or countries, to other medicines, including for HIV/AIDS, hepatitis C, cystic fibrosis, insulin, and others. Can you briefly discuss the broader and historical context of some of the root causes for this lack of access that we see in a number of different situations, including who tends to be most impacted, both country and region-wise, as well as in terms of communities of color, for example?
Absolutely. A lot of the situation that we're in and the problems that we're facing today can be traced back to 1996. 1996 was when a lot of things had happened. The WTO had turned one year old, just been formed and just got off the ground. 1996 was the year that UNAIDS was formed, and it was formed in large part because 1996 was the year that demographers discovered that the spread of HIV and AIDS had occurred primarily in third world countries to an extent that the numbers there eclipsed what was previously thought of as a Western European and American disease. 1996 was also the year in which highly effective antiretroviral therapy was developed in the United States through the extremely brave activism of young, primarily gay rights activists who had just got out of fighting for gay rights and who are now fighting for access for the creation of AIDS treatment, who are dealing primarily with very conservative American governments, the Reagan and Bush administrations, for this effort, which was obviously made more complicated by the fact that these governments openly at the time used to laugh about the idea that they would pay any attention to people who had AIDS because it was just so funny. It was just a funny, bad thing that was happening to primarily gay men. So When these medicines were developed, again, like in many circumstances, with outsized investments from the American taxpayer and the European taxpayer through the National Investments of Health, again, coincidentally, with Dr. Fauci at the helm of this effort in the same job that he holds even today, they turned what was a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition like diabetes. For those of us who are a little older in this room, if you read any coverage of AIDS prior to 1996, which I certainly did, especially in the mid to late 80s, it was really dire. It was a death sentence. That is how it was reported because that is what it was. The miraculous discoveries of 1996, however, came at a price, and that price was $10,000 a year. So it should have been a miracle that worked equally around the world, but it wasn't, because the creation of the WTO meant that the world for the first time had a weaponized global form of intellectual property rights management that was embedded at an institution that lay at the heart of what every country does. The WTO is integral to the functioning of the economy of any of its 164 member countries. Without participation in the WTO, there is really very little ability to participate in the world economy, which means that your right to exist itself is questioned. By embedding a trade rule that concerned itself with intellectual property enforcement at the WTO, it was a masterstroke of primarily one American pharmaceutical company, Pfizer, and one American tech company, IBM. What they realized was that the rents that they were collecting on intellectual property from rich countries, from Europe and the United States, had been growing and presented a really attractive revenue stream for which they had to do very little except enforce intellectual property. And the idea was, why not then enforce this around the world and start collecting rent from everywhere in the world? Which is exactly what they did at a time when very few developing countries understood these rules about intellectual property or exactly how they would be impacted by them in the future, or the fact that 25 years later they would be held ransom by these same rules. Aruna referenced a proposal by the governments of India and South Africa at the WTO to repeal or suspend the monopolies that are enforced by this trade rule at the WTO. This is a reaction by the world 25 years after the fact, in the middle of the most horrendous pandemic that we've ever encountered, which has finally driven countries like India and South Africa, but also over 100 developing countries who support that proposal, to tell the WTO that they've suffered for long enough under the absolutely punitive effects of this rule, and that enough is enough. Enough is, of course, not enough, because this proposal is not moving forward, because the WTO works on consensus, which means that every single member has to decide on any proposal that they adopt. And the fact that even one member like the United States, but in this case, several others, the European Union, the United States and Australia and Brazil, object to this suspension of intellectual property, means that at the moment it hasn't gone forward. What happened between the turn of the century and today, over the last 20 years, is that the crisis with access to AIDS medicines in parts of the world like South Africa, for instance, which had among the highest incidences and prevalences of AIDS, where people were dying by the hundreds of thousands. In the region as a whole, in sub-Saharan Africa, people died in the millions. All of this happened while these treatments were available, simply because they weren't affordable. What kept them unaffordable was the monopoly that each of the producing companies, the pharmaceutical companies, held on them in the United States. People noticed this and they started protesting this. They started protesting loudly and ferociously. They fought any number of cases, both at the WTO, and at home. Most egregiously, this is a joke. The US administration sued the South African government for introducing legislation to make medicines cheaper by being able to import them, say, from India, and then withdrew the case in shame and retreated after a worldwide public outcry sprung up against the United States government's actions. later on, this is the part of it that's a joke. I'm sorry. A pharmaceutical industry executive was asked at a conference as to why they decided to sue Nelson Mandela's government, which is what they did. And he said, "Look, we had to. Mother Teresa was already dead," which is the kind of black humor that they looked at their actions of the past with. It's just that it wasn't very humorous when it was happening in South Africa. So any attempt by countries, even with a need as dire as South Africa, with literally hundreds of thousands of lives on the line, taking the most small steps towards securing affordable medicines for people in their country, invited such wrath and such outsized anger and sanction and legal action on the part of the United States, but also in other cases from the European Union or from Japan or from any other rich country, meant that countries were very hesitant to take these laws into their own hands. They had the right to do a number of different things under the laws at the rules that they had agreed to at the WTO. Many of those rules had been enshrined in their laws and still are, but it didn't mean that they could actually use them, because using them meant opening yourself up to a whole floodgate of other threats and sanctions that could make your life very difficult if you were trying to trade. For many of these countries in sub-Saharan Africa, they also benefited from something called AGOA, which is the African Growth and Opportunity Act, where a large portion of their exports were deemed to be free of import duties to enable production and manufacturing in these countries. And the United States and the EU constituted such large economic partners that they really could not afford to be angered. The tide shifted in the early years of the 21st century when the outrage built up to such an extent that pharmaceutical companies could really no longer keep up the charade, and they had to drop the monopolies that they had. They didn't actually formally drop the monopolies, but what they did was that they allowed a range of different kinds of licensing, where they would either temporarily give up the monopoly in certain territories or create these wide licensing arrangements where 5 or 6 other companies could supply a generic version of the drug, whether that company was located in India or Brazil, or sometimes even in South Africa, which actually has a vibrant generic manufacturing industry. And so what happened is, towards about 2005 or about 2007, the problem with access to AIDS medicines for antiretrovirals was largely solved. There was a way by which lower income and lower middle income countries could access antiretroviral drugs at relatively affordable prices. They had a choice of buying them from anywhere in the world. The WHO stepped in to try to qualify and certify some of these drugs so that they could be of an assured quality. What happened then, exactly at the same time, was that people noticed that the same frame of reference of looking at medicines that were unaffordable or unavailable because of a monopoly could be naturally applied to a range of other diseases. In India, it was cancer, a form of something called chronic myeloid leukemia, for which the treatment imatinib was developed and brought to market by Novartis. Novartis had asked for patent protection on a modified version of the compound, which was denied in India because we have a patent law that holds inventors to a higher standard than in the United States or Europe. They lost that case. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. But in the meantime, Novartis also tried to strike down Indian patent law as unconstitutional for not complying with the WTO, and lost that case as well. Nevertheless, caused significant turmoil and concern for access to this key cancer medicine, which really works well in the 15 years or so that it fought these various cases against the Indian government. Meanwhile, also, Gilead, a pharmaceutical company that was much in the news last year when remdesivir, a treatment that they brought to market, was touted as possibly being of some use in the coronavirus pandemic. Gilead brought to market a drug called sofosbuvir, which was really the first big, good treatment for hepatitis C. Hepatitis C was sort of a silent killer. There had been not enough detection of hepatitis C, not enough testing to realize who had it. It turned out that it was of epidemic proportions in large parts of Eastern Europe, in large parts of Latin America, in countries like Brazil or Ukraine. Sometimes up to 20 or 30% of the populations of these countries could be affected by hepatitis C, a disease for which there was really no effective cure until sofosbuvir came along. But the price at which it was introduced shocked even the Americans. It was introduced at a price of $84,000 a year, which obviously meant that it was completely unaffordable anywhere in the world. Sofosbuvir turned into the next battleground after cancer, after AIDS, where a range of companies tried to enforce monopolies on other hepatitis C drugs in Eastern Europe and Latin America and were fought. I mean, activists fought tooth and nail. Not with as much success, though, because the companies like Gilead eventually prevailed. The number of deaths, unnecessary deaths due to hepatitis C in countries like Brazil still remains unconscionably high. And then what happened in about 2015 and 16 is that all of these problems with access to monopoly pharmaceuticals that we had seen in the third world, up to this point, we'd always thought of it as being a problem with brown and black people and people in tropical countries, turned back to the very countries that they came from, the United States, for instance, or the United Kingdom. The United States suddenly found that people in the United States found that insulin, the most commonly taken treatment by people with diabetes, because of patents on minor improvements and modifications, was suddenly absolutely unaffordable. It's been that case for several years. In the United Kingdom, I worked on a case just 2 years ago in the run-up to the British elections, where hundreds of middle-class white families were petitioning the government to take over a patent that a company called Vertex had on the first treatment for cystic fibrosis. And this is for kids who are under the age of 10. It's an absolutely vital treatment. It keeps their lungs functioning. It keeps their bodies working without pain and discomfort, allowing a much longer life than is otherwise available to young kids born with this rare disease, cystic fibrosis. But it was so expensive that one of the richest countries on earth, with one of the best funded health systems, the National Health Service, could not afford to buy the drug for British citizens who lived on the soil. And not poor British citizens, middle-class British citizens couldn't afford it because it cost $105,000 a year. And so it was a bit of a question of, I think, the snake coming back and eating its tail. It left us, I think, wondering who actually benefited from the introduction of TRIPS into the WTO 25 years ago. Who benefited from all the free trade agreements that these rich countries foisted upon middle-income and low-income countries around the world? Up to about 2014 or 15, I think you could have reasonably believed that it was the people in the third world who were suffering, but that the people in the first world and in rich countries were fine because everything was fine. Seemingly, that's not really the case. And I think what we're discovering now is that it's a very small group of people who've benefited from these unfair trade laws. It's actually really only the pharmaceutical companies and their shareholders who've benefited from all of these laws. It's not even the citizens of some of the richest countries on earth, because they too have become visibly hurt by exactly the same problem. And now in the pandemic, I think with the rolling shortage in supplies of vaccines, not just in Europe, which has a well-documented problem, but in the United States and in other parts of the world, which have bought these vaccines, I think it's coming home more than ever before that this is not a problem that is confined to merely inflicting harm and suffering upon poor people, but this is really a global problem that's affecting the rich, the poor, and everyone in between.
Thank you, Achal. And the point that you made about the role of pharmaceutical companies is a perfect segue into the next question back to Aruna. Human Rights Watch issued a new report just last week entitled Universal and Equitable Access to COVID Vaccines, Testing and Treatment, Companies' Human Rights Responsibilities, in which you write that while governments have the primary responsibility to ensure access to a safe and effective vaccine, that companies, including the pharmaceutical industry, also have human rights obligations. What should pharma companies be doing to adopt a human rights approach in this context?
Yeah. I mean, just to reiterate, I mean, it's correct that, governments have the primary responsibility. I mean, if a government decides to regulate a company, they can very easily do that, right? It's just a question of political will in terms of holding companies accountable, either through very specific conditions and contracts, or, for example, just bringing companies to the table. For example, if the US government or the European Commission or the German government were to say, we are all going to participate in there's this pool that's been created by the WHO and some other governments called the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool. Suppose they were to say that we want to participate in that, and we think all the governments, all the companies we fund should also participate in this, and we're going to do everything in our capacity to make sure the companies we fund do this and negotiate and make that possible. It can happen, right? But short of it, where that's not happening, where governments are not issuing regulations, there are no conditions attached to the funding. Does the pharmaceutical industry have a responsibility, voluntary responsibility to do things differently? The answer is a resounding yes. They cannot take advantage of regulatory gaps. They cannot say, oh, there are no funding conditions attached to us, and so we are free to do whatever we want to. Yes, they are to some extent, but they do also have human rights responsibilities. And these human rights responsibilities, what the pharmaceutical industry should hold itself to is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. There are a set of guiding principles to guide corporate action, and we can go into it in some detail, as well as the special rapporteurs, the UN Special Rapporteur on Health issued a set of guidelines for the pharmaceutical industry on access to medicines. That was issued way back in 2008. And that's not had wide acceptance, but this is the time to bring up those guidelines and look at some aspects of those around licensing, which are very modest asks, disclose your licensing terms and things like that, which companies should be doing. Now, I mean, what does the UN Guiding Principles mean, and what should a pharmaceutical company be doing? Like if you're a company, the producer of vaccines, what are your responsibilities? Now, under the UN Guiding Principles, you have to map out what are the human rights risks that your business can pose? And are you causing or contributing to any of these risks? And what steps as a company should you take to prevent and mitigate those risks? So at this particular point in time, the greatest risk is that, one of the greatest risks is the supply risk, right? As a company, the business decisions you make may contribute to an artificial supply scarcity. It can exacerbate supply problems. And so you have to prioritize business action to counter that risk. And so one is that, like, what has your company done? One part of it is that. The second part of it is pricing. There is an obvious challenge of pricing. We are talking about a pandemic where the World Bank says that anywhere between 85 million to 110 odd to 115 million people in the world are going to be in extreme poverty, living under less than $1.9 a day, right, over 2020, 2021. So in this context, if you're looking at an average household of 4 people and you're looking at pushing to universal access, not rationing to very few people, what is the pricing strategy where you don't increase health or medical debt for families or those who are uninsured, underinsured, do not have access to any insurance? Or low and middle income governments' debt, because they're all borrowing. There's already huge economic problems in countries. Countries are reeling. And so what is a pricing? What is an affordable pricing strategy for the company? Now, let's assume, and companies have already done it. Some companies have said, for example, so going back to the supply side, right? Like going back to the supply side, let's say a company says, and as activists and as Human Rights Watch's report, but also lots of other organizations, Amnesty, all the Access to Medicines world repeatedly have written, look, we think not sharing intellectual property in this situation is a huge problem. It is a risk. You're exacerbating supply challenges. And the response typically is, we don't believe so. We don't believe this is the problem. Well, that is not a discharge of a company's human rights responsibility. You have to demonstrate. The standard is know and show. You have to demonstrate who you consulted, which are the stakeholders, affected populations and stakeholders you consulted to arrive, to conduct some form of due diligence around, let's say, the issue of supply and intellectual property. What did you find? And how have you arrived at this conclusion? What have you done as a company put that information out. If you have mapped your supply, if you think you've booked X factories, you don't have to disclose every name and every commercial secret. That's not what we're interested in. Put out sufficient information that experts will look at and tell you whether you're on the right track or not. Who are the experts who are informing the company's strategy? I mean, all of this information should be out in the public. So even looking at how the process of how a company arrives at these decisions, there has to be stakeholder consultation, right? And there has to be transparency. So not only that you identify risks and respond to the risks, but also that you put out information about how you've responded to these risks. These are the measures we've taken as a company. Over time, this is how we are tracking the results of our measurements. And this is how we've consulted with stakeholders. X, Y, Z are the stakeholders we've consulted. This is the drawback they're reporting. We're continuing to work on, X, Y, Z. So for example, if I was a human rights, as a human rights organization that's tracking this, I would be looking at companies that are saying, what is the technology they're using, right? Is that technology widely used already, or it's new technology? Is there a need for technology transfers? What are they doing to prioritize technology transfers in their strategy? What are they doing about intellectual property sharing? To what extent do they support non-exclusive global licensing? So for example, if the critique from your stakeholders is that that you're following restricting licensing practices, the information that you put out has to respond to that criticism, has to respond directly to that risk that they're pointing out, not just an assertion or a denial that does not generate any trust or confidence in the company's strategy. So that's sort of the how of what they will do. Now, in terms of, let's say, pricing, for example, now companies have said, we are going to adopt an affordable pricing strategy. We want to, we think the pandemic, our company's a responsible one. We believe in nonprofit pricing. Great. Show us the information. Tell us how much of the, how much public money have you received? How much public funding and philanthropic funding have you received as a company? What are you putting in? And how does your pricing strategy respond to poverty, respond to medical debt, respond to country indebtedness? How does it factor in all of this? And how have you arrived at a pricing strategy? And are you, at the very least, committed to some form of transparency that builds confidence? Again, a company may be doing X, Y, Z things right. The question is, what are they doing? What information are they putting out in the public domain to actually respond to the needs of the other people and the demands of civil society and experts on IP and pricing strategists and patients, people who are affected by COVID, people dying, absolutely grief-ridden families begging, pleading, being part of a campaign, saying, please, we want these vaccines to be affordable and available to everybody. How are you holding yourself as a company, building confidence, building bridges, taking these people with you in the middle of the biggest crisis? I think that's the kind of transparency we are looking at. I mean, and there are ways, and there are specific things in our report, especially. I mean, in addition to looking at responding to risks, the other thing that I would touch upon is what does a company do to have equitable access? Do they have a policy? If, let's say, a company says we are committed to producing 200 million doses of vaccine, how is this 200 million divided up and given to high-income countries, upper middle-income countries, lower middle-income countries, low-income? Like, we want to see how is your equitable access policy driving these business decisions? Like, show us through facts, show us through figures, hold yourself accountable and build some confidence in what you're doing as a company and a strategy. So I think those things are really sort of key things for companies to actively, proactively communicate, I would say is central to what a company does.
Thank you, Aruna. And I'd like to turn to a couple of questions from the audience. And there's one question directly following on, Aruna, what you just discussed, that on the one hand, we do have this rather robust framework for the human rights obligations of corporations. And if you could speak to, in practice, whether there is any indication that these companies are responsive to human rights law, especially in light of another international legal framework, that of WTO TRIPS, which furnishes seemingly unassailable protections for their profit motives. And just to note that this question is from one of our clinic students, advanced clinic students, Miriam, who's done also research into the issue of vaccine access and distribution. And then right after that, Aruna, Achal, if I could put a question to you also from the audience. as to thinking about best practices and good examples, if you've seen any country or countries that have done a good job of distributing a vaccine to all citizens and how they've done it. So we could start with you, Aruna, since this is directly following on what you just discussed, and then move to Achal, please.
Thank you. I mean, I think, looking at, let's say, the top, if you look at all of these metrics, right, on each of these, on supply, on pricing, on equitable access, on transparency, how they've communicated, what are they disclosing on their contracts, and open and global non-exclusive licensing, and so on. I think on all of those metrics, if you look at companies, I think it would be, you would need a lot more analysis to say any one company is on the right direction. So far, it hasn't been. There have been some, comments about companies broadly being committed to, nonprofit pricing and so on. They have, said things like that, but that's not good enough. That's not good enough to say that's you're on the right track or you're adopting a rights-based approach. So, for example, I am not aware, and maybe Achal knows, I'm not aware of a single company so far that has, any of the big pharmaceutical companies that are vaccine producers who have signed up to the COVID-19 technology access pool. I don't know of any company that has done that. I don't know of any company that's saying we are considering this and we are open to a stakeholder dialogue about how to make this possible. I've not even seen an announcement on an open dialogue for companies that are coming forward saying that. For as far as I know, companies have said, we don't believe these are risks. Just like I said, there's no data for them to counter this, right? So that's where we are at. I think companies have to do a lot more to engage dialogue and take some of these serious recommendations from human rights organizations and access to medicines activists.
I want to echo what Aruna was saying. I think that the transparency issue is so important here. Just before I get to answering the question that you posed me, Aya, which is I think that a lot of us are comparing the efficacy of vaccines, and I tried to address that in a piece I wrote in the New York Times a week ago on the Chinese and Russian vaccines. Without full transparency and a full understanding of the clinical trial protocols and designs, it's really very difficult to compare efficacy. In a situation where you're lucky enough to have a choice of two vaccines, for instance, you really wouldn't be able to tell which one you should take unless you have full access to the underlying clinical trial data and the full protocols. Moderna and Pfizer have done a little more than is normal because of the pandemic, pushed by academics and activists in the United States, like Human Rights Watch included. The FDA in the United States has done a little more. Health Canada and the European Medicines Agency are doing more than they have in the past, but there's much, much more that needs to be done. In terms of countries that have been doing things well, this is a complicated question to answer because in terms of rates of vaccination, the country that has done it best is Israel. Israel has done it best primarily by paying 1.5 to 2 times the price of the most expensive, newest mRNA, messenger RNA vaccines that have been produced by Pfizer and Moderna. That's not an option that's open to everyone. Israel also has a fairly small population. The United Arab Emirates is not far behind, but they've done what they could in terms of the number of people they vaccinated by going into a really early agreement with Sinopharm for its Beijing vaccine, which they're very soon going to be producing in the United Arab Emirates for domestic use and for export. And I think there's a lesson there. There are many vaccines in the world that have evidence of efficacy and can be of use in this pandemic. I think that there is an unnatural restriction that some people are placing upon themselves to say, well, but how can you possibly have an original vaccine developed outside the West? Unbelievable as that sounds, I'm being sarcastic here, it is true, and it has happened, and it is happening in this pandemic. And I think to cast a wider net allows us to have more options for exiting this pandemic. And many middle-income countries who've done that have done well out of that. I think that non-Western vaccines require an infrastructure that can build credibility and trust in them, partly for no fault of their own, partly because the world is arranged as it is. I mean, the world is arranged in such a way that for something that's approved by the US FDA or by the European Medicines Agency, that's considered absolutely fine, whereas something approved by the Russian drug regulator, the Chinese drug regulator, is considered automatically suspect. And I think that's a whole other kettle of fish that we have to deal with, which is a complex psychological or psychopathic issue. But leaving that aside, I think addressing that very seriously is something that organizations like the WHO could do, but are not doing as much as they should be. They do have a sort of inbuilt understanding that somehow only a good Western vaccine will get us out of this pandemic. And I think that's short-sighted. It's just bad thinking. One lovely best practice, just very quickly to conclude, because I did see somebody mention the WHO influenza network. There is something called the flu network that works. You know, oftentimes, Aruna talked about CTAP. CTAP is the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool. It was launched with great fanfare by Dr. Ghebreyesus, the Director General of the WHO and the President of Costa Rica. I was at the launch. I'm actually one of 4 names that are listed on the website, which says endorsements by people around the world or something like that. I've never heard from them since that launch, by the way. What I have heard from WHO is that they're really not invested in CTAP and don't actually want it to work officially. And no company has signed up to it, as Aruna pointed out. Now, the funny thing is that, so whenever a thing like CTAP is proposed, people say, oh, that's just utopian, you know, you activists, you just want everything to be sort of free and open and cooperative. Funnily enough, that's how we get our flu shots. So the billions of flu shots that are given out around the world, this has been happening since 1974. It's a network called the Flu Network. It's officially called the Global Influenza Surveillance and Reporting System, based at the WHO. 110 countries, 140 laboratories, funded by governments. They work together all year. They collect flu strains. They collect intelligence on flus that are circulating in their countries, send it all back. It's analyzed. And then twice a year, the Flu Network puts out the formula for the flu vaccine, which is essentially a list of the strains that should go into the vaccine at the start of the Northern Hemisphere flu season, and then another list of the strains that should go into the vaccine at the start of the Southern Hemisphere flu season. Completely open, which means that anyone can produce it, which means that pretty much everyone does, which means that it's taken by the billions at very, very affordable prices around the world. So this utopian idea that could never be possible has actually been possible, and it's been happening for the last 45 years.
Thank you, Achal. And I just wanted to make a quick point, specifically since you had given Israel as a positive example, and there's perhaps been some recent changes to their practice, but there was a report put out by some UN special rapporteurs highlighting the point of discrimination in terms of Israel not ensuring that Palestinians under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza would have access to the available vaccines. And several UN experts had called on Israel to ensure access to the COVID vaccine. So pointing out, even in good examples, the ways in which we see unequal access to particular segments of the population. So we're at time. And thank you so very much again to both of you, Aruna Kashyap and Achal Pravala, for joining us and bringing your expertise and your insights to this, again, really crucial and timely issue. And thank you for everyone who was attending today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.